You think your job is bad? Try working 16 hours in a coal mine at age 8, or being paid in company script you can only spend at a store that overcharges you. History isn't just built on labor, it's built on exploitation. Let's talk about the worst of the worst. Pyramid builders. You've heard the myth. Ancient Egyptians built the pyramids with pride, skill, and decent wages. Sounds wholesome. It's also nonsense. The reality? Tens of thousands of workers, most of them overworked, underfed, and dying young. Let's talk numbers. The Great Pyramid of Giza alone required around 20,000 to 30,000 laborers, working day and night for at least 2 decades. Some were skilled masons, sure, but the real workforce? Conscripted farmers, forced laborers, and enslaved people. Every year, the government rounded up peasants during the Nile's flood season, promising food and shelter in exchange for their back-breaking labor. They weren't technically slaves, but they also weren't free to leave. Shifts stretched 10+ hours a day, 6 days a week, under the blazing sun. They moved 2.5-ton limestone blocks using nothing but wooden sleds, ramps, and sheer human suffering. Archaeologists have found mass burial sites near pyramid complexes, full of workers' remains. The evidence? Fractured bones, spinal injuries, and worn-down joints from years of non-stop heavy lifting. Many never saw their families again. The benefits package? A diet of bread, onions, and beer, which kept them alive but left them malnourished. If you got sick or injured, you didn't get time off. You got replaced. Some work teams had nicknames. Archaeologists found graffiti left behind by groups called the Drunkards of Menkaure and the Friends of Khufu. Whether that was workplace camaraderie or just coping with misery, who knows? Roman slave labor. Rome wasn't built in a day, but it was built on the backs of millions of enslaved people. From gladiator arenas to sprawling farms, the Roman economy depended entirely on forced labor. And unlike the Egyptians, who at least pretended to hire workers, the Romans didn't bother with illusions. If you were a slave, you worked, or you died. By the 1st century BCE, nearly 1/3 of Italy's population was enslaved, 2 to 3 million people. Rome wasn't picky about where it got its workforce. War captives, criminals, kidnapped civilians, it didn't matter. If you could hold a tool, carry a load, or entertain a crowd by getting mauled to death in an arena, you were put to work. The worst fate? Mining. Roman silver, lead, and gold mines were death traps, full of toxic fumes and collapsing tunnels. Workers labored chained together, hacking through rock 12 to 16 hours a day with little food or rest. The average miner didn't last more than a few years. Then there were the latifundia, massive plantation-style farms. These weren't small family plots, they were corporate agricultural machines, worked by hundreds of enslaved laborers under brutal overseers. They plowed, harvested, and processed food for the Roman elite. If they collapsed from exhaustion, they were left to die where they fell. And let's not forget the gladiators. Not all were enslaved, but most were. If you were bought by a gladiator school, you trained like a soldier but lived like a prisoner. Your life expectancy? Maybe 5 fights, if you were lucky. If you refused to fight, you were executed for being useless. Rebellion wasn't an option, unless you wanted the full wrath of Rome. Spartacus and his 70,000 rebel slaves tried in 73 BCE. It ended with 6,000 crucified along the Appian Way. A brutal reminder. In Rome, slaves were tools, not people. The Silk Road and forced artisanship. The Silk Road brought luxury to the world, but for the workers producing that silk, it was centuries of government-controlled exploitation. China guarded silk production like a state secret, not just to keep a monopoly, but because their entire economy ran on the backs of forced artisans and laborers. By the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, China's silk industry was a well-oiled machine of exploitation. The government controlled every aspect of silk production, from farming the mulberry trees to harvesting the silk threads. Peasant farmers and workers, many of them women and children, were forced into silk production with little choice. Some families were assigned silk making as a hereditary duty, meaning you were born into forced labor and died in it. Conditions were brutal. Silkworms had to be tended constantly, and the workers were forbidden from doing anything else. Extracting the silk meant boiling the worms alive to preserve the threads, a process that had to be done precisely, without error, or workers were punished. Imperial overseers ensured quotas were met, and failure meant physical punishment or worse. And if you thought about sharing the silk-making secrets, bad idea. The Chinese government made smuggling silk punishable by death. Anyone caught trying to export silkworms, eggs, or weaving techniques was executed on the spot. For centuries, silk stayed China's state-controlled cash cow, while the workers saw none of the wealth it generated. By the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, the silk industry was massive, exporting luxury goods across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. But the labor conditions? Still awful. Artisans were drafted into government-run workshops, often working long hours in poor conditions. If you were skilled enough, you might be forced to weave exclusively for the imperial court, with no way out. And what happened when silk production spread to other regions? Did things get better for workers? Nope. Instead of improving conditions, other civilizations just copied the exploitation model. Silk was luxury, unless you were the one making it. The Atlantic slave trade. If you want to talk about labor markets built entirely on suffering, nothing tops the Atlantic slave trade. For over 350 years, millions of Africans were kidnapped, sold, and forced into lifetimes of brutal, unpaid labor to fuel the economies of Europe and the Americas. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, an estimated 12.5 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and crammed into filthy, disease-ridden ships. Of those, around 1.8 million died before even reaching land. Bodies were tossed overboard like trash. If you survived the voyage, your reward was a lifetime of forced labor on plantations, in mines, or as servants, with zero chance of freedom. The most notorious labor system? Plantations in the Americas. In Brazil and the Caribbean, enslaved Africans worked 12 to 16-hour shifts, growing sugarcane, coffee, and tobacco, cash crops that made European empires filthy rich. In the US, cotton became the backbone of the Southern economy, and slave labor ensured profits stayed high. The conditions? Nightmarish. Workers faced endless hours of backbreaking labor, malnutrition, disease, and extreme physical punishment. Plantation owners didn't care about long-term survival. They could always buy more people. Some plantations had death rates so high that enslaved people were literally worked to death and replaced within a few years. And it wasn't just farms. Enslaved Africans were forced into every kind of labor, from building cities to working in docks, factories, and mines. Even children weren't spared. Slaveholders treated them as profit-generating property, not human beings. Revolts were brutally crushed, laws made escape nearly impossible, and any attempt to fight back was met with mass executions, public torture, and even entire villages being burned. The message was clear: work or die. The Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution promised progress, innovation, and economic growth. What it actually delivered? A century of overworked, underpaid, and physically broken workers, many of them children. By the early 19th century, factories had spread across Britain, the US, and Western Europe. Machines were faster, industries boomed, and the demand for cheap labor skyrocketed. Factory owners weren't looking for skilled workers. They wanted as many bodies as possible for the lowest cost. That meant women, immigrants, and even children as young as 5 were put to work in horrific conditions. Shifts stretched 14 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. The pay? Pennies per hour, if that. In textile mills, workers inhaled cotton dust, leading to deadly lung diseases. In coal mines, children, nicknamed breaker boys, spent hours smashing coal with their bare hands, covered in soot, with zero protective gear. Injuries were common, deaths were routine, and safety laws were non-existent. And speaking of non-existent laws, let's talk about child labor. By 1830, nearly 50% of Britain's textile workforce was under 16. In the US, factory owners hired kids for one reason: small hands could reach inside dangerous machines. If a child got caught in a spinning loom, too bad. Factory bosses had plenty more waiting to take their place. Conditions were so brutal that workers started fighting back. The Luddites, a group of English textile workers, literally smashed machines in protest. Labor unions began forming, leading to strikes and violent clashes with factory owners who hired private police to break up protests, sometimes with bullets. But did industrialists care? Not really. Factory towns kept workers trapped in cycles of poverty. Companies built cramped, disease-ridden tenements, paid workers just enough to survive but not escape, and charged them for rent and food. A perfect scam that made sure they never got ahead. And when child labor laws finally passed, they took decades to be enforced. Even today, some industries still rely on exploitative sweatshops because, apparently, cheap labor never goes out of style. The coal mines. Coal powered the Industrial Revolution, but the real fuel? Workers who coughed up their lungs for pennies. If factory conditions were bad, coal mines were a whole new level of hell. By 1850, Britain had over 200,000 coal miners, many of them children as young as 5. In the US, by 1900, 500,000 men and boys were working underground. Why kids? Because they were small enough to crawl into spaces adults couldn't reach, a job that often ended with a crushed skull or lost limb. Miners worked 12 to 16-hour shifts, deep underground in pitch-black tunnels where the air was thick with toxic coal dust. There were no ventilation systems, no protective gear, and no safety regulations. Just pickaxes, shovels, and the constant risk of death. Cave-ins, gas explosions, and flooding were daily threats. One wrong move? Buried alive? The worst job, being a breaker boy. These were kids between 6 and 12, stationed above ground to sort coal by hand. They sat on wooden planks, breaking coal into smaller pieces from sunrise to sunset. No gloves, no masks, just bare hands and lungs full of dust. Many developed black lung before they hit their teens, and if they weren't careful, their fingers got caught in the conveyor belts. And guess what? Miners weren't even paid real money. Many were trapped in company towns, where wages were issued in company currency, only valid at company-owned stores. The stores? Overpriced, ensuring miners were always in debt. If you lost your job, you lost your home too. Miners tried to fight back. In 1902, Pennsylvania miners went on strike for higher wages and an 8-hour workday. The response? The U.S. government sent in federal troops. By the 20th century, child labor laws and safety regulations finally started improving conditions. But even today, thousands die every year in unsafe mines worldwide. Because if history has proven anything, it's this: profits always come before people. The coolie system. When slavery was abolished in many parts of the world, did labor exploitation end? Not even close. Instead, colonial powers got creative and rebranded forced labor under a new name: indentured servitude. The result? The coolie system. A massive global labor scam that trapped millions of Chinese, Indian, and Southeast Asian workers in brutal, low-wage jobs across the British Empire, the Americas, and beyond. Between 1834 and 1920, over 2 million Indians and 500,000 Chinese laborers were shipped off to work in plantations, railroads, and mines. They were lured in with false promises of good wages and fair treatment. The reality? Horrific conditions, extreme abuse, and zero way out. Take sugar plantations in the Caribbean and South America. After Britain abolished slavery in 1833, planters in places like Trinidad, Guyana, and Mauritius still needed cheap labor. Enter the indenture contract. Workers were told they'd get free passage, housing, and fair wages, but in tiny print? A 5-year contract that was almost impossible to escape. Shifts stretched 14 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, in brutal heat. Pay? A few cents per day. Beatings, wage theft, and disease were commonplace. Many died before their contracts ended. If they tried to escape or protest, they were whipped, fined, or imprisoned. And let's talk about railroads. Chinese laborers were brought in by the thousands to build the U.S. Transcontinental Railroad in the 1860s. Pay was half of what white workers got, and they were forced to do the most dangerous jobs, like blasting tunnels with nitroglycerin. Hundreds died in explosions or from falling off cliffs. Did governments step in to help? Nope. In fact, places like the US, Canada, and Australia passed laws to ban Chinese immigrants after squeezing out their labor. By the early 1900s, the indentured system officially ended, but the damage was done. Millions were exploited, and colonial economies thrived. Slavery was outlawed, but history proved something else. Change the label, and forced labor keeps going. Company towns. Slavery and indentured servitude weren't the only ways to trap workers. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, industries found a new way to control labor without chains or whips. They built company towns. Sounds nice, right? Except these were designed to keep workers in permanent debt, ensuring they could never leave. At their peak, there were over 2,500 company towns in the US alone. The coal, steel, and logging industries were the worst offenders, with companies like US Steel, Pullman, and Ford setting up entire towns where they owned everything: the houses, the stores, even the schools. Workers weren't just employed by the company, they lived, shopped, and died under its control. Here's how the scam worked. Instead of paying wages in real money, companies issued scrip, a fake currency that could only be spent at company-owned stores. The catch? Prices at these stores were inflated, meaning workers had to spend everything they earned just to survive. Rent, paid to the company; groceries, bought from the company; medical care, you guessed it, only available through the company. The result? Permanent debt. If workers tried to leave, they were often chased down, threatened, or blacklisted from other jobs. Strikes? Met with armed guards, evictions, and sometimes straight-up violence. One of the worst examples? Pullman, Illinois. a model town built by the Pullman Company in the 1880s for its railroad workers. The town looked modern, with brick houses, paved streets, and a fancy hotel, but workers had no rights, no private property, and no way to fight back. When the economy collapsed in 1894, Pullman cut wages, but didn't lower rents. Thousands of desperate workers went on strike. The government's response? They sent in federal troops. 30 workers were killed, and the strike was crushed. Company towns started disappearing in the mid-20th century, but the model never really died. Corporations still use monopoly tactics to control workers, low wages, inflated costs, and debt traps that make escape nearly impossible. Different name, same story. When your boss owns your house, your food, and your paycheck, you're not working. You're trapped. Migrant farm workers. Slavery was outlawed, company towns started disappearing, and child labor laws were passed. So, did labor exploitation finally end? Not even close. Instead, industries just shifted their abuse to a new, disposable workforce: migrant farm workers. In the US alone, over 2.4 million farm workers pick the food that fills grocery stores. At least half are undocumented, meaning they have no legal protections, no bargaining power, and no way to report abuse. Many live in overcrowded labor camps, earn less than minimum wage, and are constantly exposed to dangerous pesticides. Exploitation of migrant farm workers isn't new. It became official government policy in 1942 with the launch of the Bracero program, an agreement between the US and Mexico that brought in 4.5 million Mexican workers to fill labor shortages during World War II. They were promised fair wages, housing, and humane treatment. What they got? 12-hour shifts in extreme heat, filthy living conditions, and wages so low they could barely afford food. Many were never paid at all. When the program ended in 1964, farm owners didn't stop hiring migrants. They just found ways to keep wages low and conditions terrible. Even today, many workers are paid by the piece, not by the hour, meaning if a worker picks 2 tons of tomatoes in a day, they might earn $50. If they get sick or injured? Too bad. Most have no health care, no sick leave, and no job security. And let's talk about child labor. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 banned child labor in factories but left agriculture out. That means today, hundreds of thousands of children, some as young as 10, work legally on US farms. They pick crops under the sun, use sharp tools, and handle pesticides known to cause cancer and birth defects. Attempts to improve conditions have been met with fierce resistance from the agriculture industry. Every time new labor protections are proposed, corporate lobbyists shut them down, claiming that farm workers should be grateful for the work. And here's the kicker. This isn't just a US problem. Globally, farm workers in Latin America, Africa, and Asia face the same conditions. Because as long as people want cheap food, companies will find ways to cut labor costs, no matter the human cost. Modern sweatshops. Labor exploitation isn't ancient history. It's alive, thriving, and probably hanging in your closet right now. Modern sweatshops, the factories behind fast fashion, cheap electronics, and discount goods, are just as brutal as the worst labor systems in history. Right now, an estimated 75 million garment workers produce clothing for the world's biggest brands. Over 85% are women, mostly in Bangladesh, China, India, and Vietnam, earning as little as $2 per day. Some work 100-hour weeks in overcrowded, unventilated factories where temperatures soar past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. If they collapse from exhaustion, the bosses fire them and hire someone else. And safety? Non-existent. In 2013, the Rana Plaza factory in Bangladesh collapsed, killing 1,134 workers and injuring over 2,500 more. The building had visible cracks the day before, but when workers refused to enter, managers threatened to fire them. The next morning, the entire factory crumbled. And yet, major brands still source clothes from factories just like it, where workers are trapped in fire-prone buildings, exposed to toxic chemicals, and subjected to physical abuse. But it's not just fashion. Sweatshops power nearly every industry. In China, thousands of workers are forced into 9-6-6 schedules, working 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week, at tech factories that supply Apple, Samsung, and other major brands. Some factories are so horrific that they've installed suicide nets to stop workers from jumping off the roofs. And then there's forced labor. In China's Xinjiang region, an estimated 1 million Uyghur Muslims are imprisoned in re-education camps, many forced to produce cotton, electronics, and textiles for global brands. Think labor laws will stop this? Think again. Sweatshops survive by using subcontractors, shell companies, and offshore loopholes that make it almost impossible to hold brands accountable. The entire system survives because people want cheap products fast. As long as corporations prioritize profits over people, sweatshops won't disappear. They'll just move to the next country willing to exploit its workers. History's worst labor markets? They never ended. They just changed locations.